Okay, so we're going to talk about Noah's flood, the catastrophe that radically changed the world. Many people don't appreciate how much it altered the world. For example, the question was about the pyramids. My wife and I saw the pyramids about a month ago. We were looking at the pyramids, touching the stone, and thought, wow, these are massive things. And the question, if on conventional Egyptian chronology, would say that they were older than the timing in the scripture of the flood. So some people speculate, did they exist before the flood and carried through? As we're going to see, that's highly unlikely, simply because of what happened on the earth during the flood event. Okay, so by the way, I'm having a problem with the resources. I'm not having enough for tomorrow. And so when I got 2 more churches, I'm finding I'm running out of books. You guys are buying too much. Right? This is an awful thing to have. So, no, it's great that glad you're getting all the resources out there. It's fantastic. So, was the world ever completely covered in water? And if so, why is that important? Well, that's the question we're examining. So, what evidence is there that actually the world was actually inundated with water? So we have there's 2 times in the earth history, according to the Bible, where the earth was covered completely in water. That was on the original creation. Talks about the earth and that the Spirit was hovering over the surface of the deep. So that's one time when the earth was completely covered in water. There wasn't even any land. It was completely earth with covered completely over with water. And of course, later on, separated between the ocean and land. All right, and of course, the second event, according to the scriptures, was in the flood of Noah, where it completely covered the earth up to covering the high mountains, as it said. So, when you look at these things like the sedimentary rock, if you have never heard the creation explanation, you would think in terms of millions of years, because that's what you're told. That's what you're told in schools. You go to the interpretation center at various locations, they'll tell you it took millions and years, billions of years for all of this. Why would you think anything different? Okay. Except that now, of course, we know differently. And so what about Jesus and Peter? What did they taught? As it says, for in the days of Noah, as remember the scripture verse we talked before, that Jesus said, that's how it was in the world. People were eating, drinking, carrying on as if nothing was going to happen, and the flood came and washed them all away. Jesus' second coming would be a parallel to that. People were eating and drinking and giving in marriage until Jesus comes back, and then everybody's going to be, again, just like the first flood was a time of judgment, Jesus coming again will also be a time of judgment on the earth. You just have to read Revelations a little bit to realize it's going to be an awful time, okay, on the earth. So Jesus actually believed in the flood. He referred to it. And Peter talks about there being in the days of Noah, when the ark was being built, refers to that there was only 8 people in the ark. And also later on in 2 Peter, he talks about that if he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, preacher of righteousness, and 7 others. So obviously Peter, just like all the apostles in the church, accepted that the flood was a real historical event. And it was significant in the life of the church because the flood was a time of judgment. All the Jews of that time would have accepted that. Nobody would have had actually any questions as to whether that was. However, there are some people said, and here's a quote, the scientific and historical evidence is now clear. There has never been a global flood that covered the entire earth, nor did all modern animals and humans descend from the passengers of a single vessel. So you would think that this would be an atheist site or a secular site. That's not. It's from an ostensibly Christian site, from an organization called Biologos. Biologos wants you to believe that there was never a flood. In fact, according to this article in Biologos, that Jesus was wrong and Peter was wrong. Now, N.T. Wright, a very well-known and respected Anglican theologian, and Dr. Francis Collins, who was the head of the Human Genome Project and was for many years the head of the National Institute of Health in the United States. Some of you might have heard him on about during the pandemic, about COVID treatment, etc., etc. So he founded Biologos, not N.T. Wright, and they did this video on YouTube, which at that time was 10,000 views. They're praising evolution because this is what God, they said, used to bring us here. So these are the theologians and the Christian influencers When people look at, and many times they'll say, Francis Collins, oh, he's a Christian, he's a scientist, so you should listen to him. Well, I suggest that maybe you ought not to listen to him very closely on some of these things. In fact, I find it rather odd because the statement that the scientific evidence that he said is now clear that there never was a water covered the earth, which I find rather funny because in Live Science there's an article which says 1.5 billion year old earth had water everywhere, what not one continent, studies suggest. So this is a secular science organization that says, yes, at one time the earth was completely covered in water. Now we would disagree with the timing, but if secular scientists are saying that the world was covered in water at one time, now all of these things are always subject to dispute and changing all the time. But so how can Biologos claim that the scientific evidence is clear? Well, it's obviously not clear. And I find it very interesting because people can recognize the signs of water inundations or flooding. In fact, even on Mars. The planet Mars has evidence of flooding. Now, whether it's a global one, we do not know, but it says here, cross-bedding seen in the layers of this Martian rock is evidence of movement of water recorded by waves or ripples of loose sediment the water passed over. Exactly the scenario that we're saying, moving water creates all these strata, and the fact that you have cross-bedding means that they were changing directions, laying out material. Okay, so cross-bedding is evidence of moving water flood. Now, if it's clear on a planet which has no water that there was flooding, why would it be so outlandish to suppose a planet which has 70% water would never have had a global flood? It doesn't, I don't understand the logic of these people, right? I mean, there's many diverse opinions on the flood, but there's actually only one opinion that matters, isn't it? Somebody was there. Well, who was there? Well, God was there. And the Bible isn't man's word about God. It is God's word about man. The very important distinction. It isn't, yes, God used men to write this book, but it's not as if man somehow came up with all these ideas on their own. This is the word of God, so we believe he used men to have it written down. It is God's word that we're arguing for. And if anybody should know what happened in the past, well, it would be God, wouldn't it? Here's a timeline. It's a little hard to see from you in the back, but this is from Genesis. Genesis at the start here. This is day 1, all the way to the time of Christ, where basically the New Testament history is recorded, about AD 100. And you'll notice that the book of Genesis covers by far the greatest stretch of history, from creation till about 2,400 years. And the way it covers. So it covers the time period before the flood and the period after the flood up until the time that Joseph dies, right before they'd end up going the Exodus to Egypt, to Israel. So the flood event happened about 1,600 years after the initial creation. Okay, 1,600 years. Now, if we look a little closer at the genealogies, you will see here it starts off with who's the first man? You are correct, Adam. Okay, so Adam lived how long? He lived 930 years, and then he died. And Seth was 130 years old when Adam was 130 years old when Seth was born, and you have all these dates. This is basically where we get the chronology on the history of the world from these accounts. Okay, this is Genesis chapter 5. Okay, you'll notice Enoch was lived only 365 years, poor guy, right? 365 years, but because he was translated right to heaven, he didn't see death. Okay, so the flood happened about 1,656 years after creation. But it's interesting to note that Adam and Noah are only separated by 2 generations. The idea being that if Adam lived 930 years, he could have talked to any of his descendants, Enoch, Seth, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, etc., including Methuselah. So let's say Methuselah, who shortly after Methuselah, then you have Lamech, and then you have Noah. Okay? So I'm sure Adam, being a very old guy, had lots of stories. So, Grandpa, or great-great-great-great-grandpa, tell us what happened at the beginning. Well, in the beginning, God created heavens and the earth. And so we recounted the story to all his ancestors, including Methuselah, who would then have told the same story to Noah. So there's only 2 generations separating Adam and Noah. And of course, Noah lived right through the flood, and so did his son. Now, Noah lived 950 years. His son Shem, he had 2 other sons, only lived 600 years. Okay? So that's very interesting. Another thing that's very interesting is that prior to the flood, here again, the creation date and the flood's about here, right, that line here, you'll see that the relatively consistent lifespan of about 900 years. How long were Adam and Eve supposed to live? Forever, right? If they hadn't eaten the garden, eaten the fruit that they were forbidden to eat, they would have been able to live forever, eating of the tree of life. So I'm just going to take your picture here, folks. So, just while I'm thinking about it, just so I can prove to my wife where I was. No, just so I can get a head count later. Okay, so you will notice, though, that after the flood, the lifespan shortened up quite significantly, okay, until Abraham and Joseph, 110 years. It was quite a decline from Noah, who lived 950, and then down to 110. That's almost 1/10 of the lifespan over a very short period of time. Why do you suppose that was? Well, some people have presupposed that the environment before the flood was a lot different, higher in oxygen, and people just lived longer. However, probably the most likely explanation is of genetics. The problem of when you have inbreeding. Because prior to, when Adam was born, his DNA would have been perfect. There would have been no genetic defects to pass on to his children. Now, every generation you get a little more. But there's only about 6-7 generations between Adam and Noah. Right? But Noah, we are all descendant from the children of Noah. So therefore, the number of genetic mutations would have started to increase rather rapidly, greatly reducing lifespan. Okay? So that's probably the reason why lifespan was reduced, rather than simply the environmental changes happen. Okay? It's also interesting to note that Noah died just 4 years before Abraham was born. And that, as it says here, Shem was alive with Abraham for 149 years. So Abraham, who would have passed it on to his children, was living contemporaneous with Shem, who actually lived hundreds of years before the flood. So how would we know the events of the flood? Abraham talked to Shem, who actually lived through the flood, tell all what happened. We wish he had recorded more details, might have done so. We just don't have the records for that. Okay, I find that very interesting. So, Shem was alive for 149 years along with Abraham. Well, it's not recorded in the Scripture, but at least they're living at the same time. So, what about the biblical evidence for the flood? Well, what was the need for the ark? Why did God command Noah to build an ark? And the story here, well, because people had become, and the situation on the earth had become so bad, so violent, so corrupt, so degenerate, that God was actually sorry that he made mankind. His beautiful, perfect creation, when he made Adam and Eve, perfect, pure, innocent, mankind had become so corrupt and so degenerated that God lamented having made these creatures because they had become so corrupt. Little bit of that going on in our society today. I wonder if God is saying, what's happening to humanity? They're just finding greater and greater ways to become more degenerate and corrupt and think of things that are just mind-boggling. I don't know, you can add your words to that. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. So the ark was built for Noah and his family, or Noah built the ark for Noah and his family and all the animals on the face of the earth. Okay, so it wasn't to save the people before the flood. It was only to save Noah and his family, because the other people were they were under God's judgment. They were going to be destroyed. They were not allowed to go through to the other side, to the flood. It's very, very sobering indeed, because the wrath of God is indeed real. And that's one of the things that the flood tells us. You cannot fool around with God. Right? It is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of a living God, as we see here. When you think there could have been billions of people who lived before the flood, it was only 8 people who actually made it through. So, what about this? That's rather sobering, isn't it? So what about the size of the ark? Well, the ark was indeed a massive vessel. It was made in a funny shape, but this is a very interesting shape because even ships like these super tankers have the same sort of dimensions, height, width, length. And the super tankers carrying a lot of oil from Russia over to, never mind, but oil around the earth. Now you'll notice that it doesn't, the super tankers have a bow, right, a pointed bow. The ark didn't have one. It didn't need one. It wasn't really going anywhere, right? It had no destination in mind because it was just floating. Didn't need a rudder. Right? It was just sort of floating around. And were these, here the Answers in Genesis actually built one. Anybody seen the ark encounter in Kentucky? Is it impressive? Yes, it is. There we have it, folks, fully endorsed. Okay. The largest man-made wooden structure in the United States. And they use a lot of Amish who are good with working to build it. Now, the facade here, the front side is all wood. The other side is concrete, so it really wouldn't float. It would flip over. But if you ever have a chance to go, it is awesome. And the amount of space inside, wow, I didn't think it was that big. Usually when you see these books, they have these little cartoon bathtub arks which have pointy ends and the giraffe sticking his head out the top there, just barely make it on. And so, actually, Answers in Genesis or Creation Ministries will publish no books with those type of arks, cartoon or bathtub arks. You won't find any books like that. We always want to depict it as a realistic size or realistic dimension, just so people would think it's not a joke. Right, that is actually a full, real ark, real vessel. As far as stable, studies have shown that this is extremely stable, even in the violent conditions that would have been during the flood event. Okay, it wouldn't have been just a tranquil, just la-di-da, a cruise somewhere. It would have been obviously a lot of topsy-turvy and turmoil, but it's very self-righting, even righting itself having tilted over 60 degrees and back. Okay. Whether it actually encountered those conditions, we don't know, but at least the stability was factored in. What about the animals in the ark? Oftentimes, people who criticize the flood said, how are you going to get all those animals in the ark? Why, there are billions of animals, right, and millions of species of animals to get on the ark. How are they going to fit? Okay, well, that begs a few questions, right? There's actually an answer for this. All right, so how many animals did God bring to Noah to put in the ark? So what he bought was 1 pair of all land-bearing, air-breathing animals and birds. Okay. How about the fish? Did he need to bring the fish into the ark? No, they lived in the water. What was the flood? Flood's water, right? Okay, perfect. Okay. What about clean animals? So about 7 pairs of clean animals. So in total, it would only have been needed about 16,000 animals. 8,000 pairs plus a few, 7. What do you mean 8,000 animals? Or 8,000 pairs? How would that fit? I thought, but there's lots more species of cats and dogs and varieties of all of those things. Why would you only need that? Because, and actually that 16,000 animals would take only up about 1/3 of the space of the boat, the ship. The rest would have been food and storage and waste disposal and all that kind of stuff. So John Woodmanthrope did a feasibility study in Noah's Ark. It's about 1 inch thick. I don't know if we have it because people like you have been buying those books, so I don't have any left. But so he did a study of all aspects of the flood, including light, heat, waste management, feeding, hibernation and all these animals, where they're going to fit, etc. And the Ark in Kentucky is actually based a lot on what comes out of this book. So they modeled it on that. He did a thorough analysis. It's very detailed, if you're interested in that. And he's saying that you only needed about 16,000 animals. So let's look at the size of the ark. The size of the ark had a capacity of about, you could fit a 747 or 2 in there, of about 520 railway stock cars. That's a railway stock car. And if you were to put 240 sheep in each stock car, times 520, you could have put about 124,000 sheep on the ark. That's a lot of sheep. But how many sheep had to go on the ark? 7. Because it was a clean animal, right? Before sacrifice. Okay. All right, so we're playing more. What about dinosaurs? Were dinosaurs on the ark? Quite probably, yes. We believe they were in the ark. Oh, come on. How are you going to fit those brontosaurus, gigantosaurus, these creatures that were longer than this building on the ark? Well, you wouldn't have brought those on the ark. Why would you bring them on the ark? Why don't you bring the young ones? So, for example, as far as how did dinosaurs start out as? Are they born live or from eggs? Eggs. They're born from eggs. The largest dinosaur egg has been found is about this big. And they find lots of dinosaur nests, fossilized, including some with embryos inside. Okay, so a dinosaur egg is about this big, and the dinosaurs, some of them are over 100 feet, 33 meters long. Okay, so obviously it had a great... So scientists believe they actually underwent a growth spurt. So in their juvenile age, they were relatively small. When they hit a certain age, like 5 years, all of a sudden they would start gaining in mass, something like an African elephant per year. Just gaining in mass per year until they got the size they are with the largest one. So why would you bring the adult ones, which are old and slow, when you could have brought the juvenile ones, which are just starting out in their growth spurt? And so if you bring them before they undergo the growth spurt, they wouldn't have eaten that much. Right? So as you hear, we have some Apatosaurus or Brontosaurus, some kind of creature like that, so a long-necked dinosaur. So let's bring a smaller one. With the power of PowerPoint, we're going to just shrink that fella down and look at that. Perfect, solve the problem. What about a T-Rex? No problem. PowerPoint, there we are. Instantly solved, solution. No, the idea being bring the young ones on. They'll fit lots of spaces. And how many dinosaurs did you actually need to bring? Well, that's a question. What about dinosaurs? The term dinosaur was coined in 1841 by Owens. I forget his first name again. Sir Owens of the British Museum. Terribly, fearfully great reptiles. Okay, what did they call them before they were called dinosaurs? Dragons. Oh, yeah, you guys have had that talk that was Tom 2 years ago. You had that talk. Dragons. So dragons are actually... So here's an old 16th century tapestry. And if you look in the corner, I'll just blow it up a bit. You have a creature which is winged sort of creature. Looks like... What does it look kind of like? Kind of looks like a dragon, right? And there's another one here, close up. So the ark is in the background. You notice it's not like a bathtub ark. Okay, but... They're buying all these animals, and some creatures could have been a dinosaur they brought on there. Okay, so, but wait a minute. How do you account for 16,000 animals or 8,000? 8,000 kinds of animals. So when God was bringing, or Noah, right onto the ark, God created animals to reproduce according to their kind. So. Didn't have to bring all the species that came out of a particular kind. You only had to bring an archetypal kind. So, for example, both creationists and evolutionists agreed that all the dogs that we have on the earth, even those mutant little yappy little white dogs, right? Anyway, so all descended from an original archetypal kind of like a wolf. So it would have had the genetic variety or diversity in its genetic code in order to allow variations of all kinds of different dogs. Europe, some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are unnatural, like the ones that are human-bred or purebred dogs. They would never exist in the wild. Right? My wife's aunt had a dog she put in her purse. Right? This dog, when she wanted to transport, put in her purse. Yeah, sorry, that's not a dog. I'm sorry, I don't care what it is. So, little story. So, during the pandemic, when the pandemic started, so I went around the neighborhood and said hello, check on people. And so I went to one place, and they have this little dog. Yes, I don't know, maybe look at my white hair and this little white dog isn't jealous or something. I don't know. So anyway, so this thing is jealous. So the guy held up his dog and said, oh, no, he just wants to smell you. Just bring your hand closer. So I bring up my hand. He bit me, that little thing. I said, oh. Yeah, okay, so don't trust those little things. Anyway, I'm digressing here. So all you needed to bring 2 dog kinds, the original, an archetypal, and then later on through the natural selection and breeding, then you would have all the varieties of dogs we have on earth. Same would go for cat kind. You bring an original cat kind and you get lions and tigers and leopards and jaguars and all that stuff are all descended of the original cat kind. So you only need 2 dogs, 2 cat kinds, 2 of the dinosaur kinds. How many dinosaur kinds would there be? They've estimated about 55 dinosaur kinds. That's all there was, 55 dinosaur kinds. You'd have to have my dinosaur talk, which we are giving in another few years. So anyway, you have to come back. No, I'll have to come back. So you could easily fit 16,000 animals if you only had 8,000 kinds to bring into the ark. So that would explain that you didn't need all those different species or varieties, subspecies, etc., etc. The only thing I'm a little disappointed on is where God allowed the mosquitoes to go on. That would have been, I think that was a mistake, I think, if anything. Anyhow.
You said there weren't any insects.
Well, there obviously were insects, but they hitched a ride. They were unintentional visitors, I think. Did I say, I wrote that? Yeah. Okay. But God didn't purposely bring, anyway, it's insects. Okay. So the judgment was universal, as we talked about, that the flood of Noah was universal. In other words, it covered the entire earth. Now, most of us would accept that, but a lot of people do not. Many Christian apologists would say, it was a local flood. And we'll talk about that. Okay? The flood was a type of judgment to come. So the flood was, we mentioned already that it was a global flood. And there was, when the flood, Noah was building this ark, and people were watching Noah building this ark. This was the talk of the town. Not much else is happening, but some nut job is building an ark. Why is he building an ark? Because some God told him to do that. Why? Well, because only Noah and the animals are going to survive. The rest of people are going to, be judged and drowned. So people were laughing and mocking at Noah and his family for doing something. So there isn't any water around. There's no lake. How are you going to move this from there into any body of water, which who knows where it is? This would be crazy, Noah. And from the surface of it, yes, it does. It did look crazy. So that's why nobody came on the ark, because they all thought he was crazy. Now, when the rain started coming down and the flood water started rising, a lot of people became believers. Except that it was too late, because God had a week prior to that shut the ark door, closed the door. It wasn't Noah who closed it, it was God who closed it and said, sorry, it's been cut off, no longer an opportunity to come in. The church for 2,000 years has been telling people, Jesus is going to come back. Yeah, we heard this before. Yeah, we know all that. So whatever, right? Until the time Jesus is going to come back, literally going to come back, and then people will become believers. But it will be too late at that time. People are waiting till deathbed repentance, which actually never happens, right? Why would you at the last minute wait? And that's where a lot of people are saying, I'll just change my mind. Yeah, well, it doesn't usually work that way. So it was a kind of judgment. And Jesus warned of the judgment to come. We already covered that a bit. And Peter warned of the judgment to come. So the Bible tells us that the waters of the flood were above the mountains. And it said the waters prevailed above, covering them 15 cubits. Cubits about 1.5 feet. And so about 22 feet above the highest mountains, they say, it covered. So that's an awful lot of water. So I asked my family for a Bible encyclopedia, 5 volumes, okay, so more information. And I looked at the article on the flood. Now, people who write encyclopedias are obviously very smart, degrees and stuff like that, a lot of research. So in the article on the flood, the author said he'd agreed that the church universally has said that the flood was global, covering the entire earth. But he didn't think so. And the reason is, one of the major reasons is Mount Everest. Now, Mount Everest is the tallest mountain in the world. It's about 29,000, almost 30,000 feet. And he said, well, how is the water from the flood going to get up to 29,000 feet? There isn't enough water. It'd have to be 7 times the amount of water on the earth to cover Mount Everest. And if that was the case, yeah, he'd have a point. But he didn't go to creation.com and check this thing out. Because one of the interesting, and this has to do with people who think the flood of the Noah was local. It just happened in the Black Sea area around where Ukraine is right now, and Turkey. But how is a local flood going to cover a mountain? Right? It couldn't do that. Okay? But one of the things that he didn't thought of, he assumed that Mount Everest was there before the flood, rather than as a consequence of the flood. And one of the things we know for people who have actually climbed up there, and some of them who climbed up there are still there, right? That there is within 200 feet of the top of Mount Everest, there are marine fossils. Which means, in this layer here, you see the strata here, marine fossils. Well, what are marine? These are creatures that lived in the ocean that turned into rock. So that tells us that the actual summit of Mount Everest was only 200 feet above sea level at one time. Is there enough water to cover 200 feet above sea level? Absolutely. Okay. So he was thinking that Mount Everest was there before the flood, and the water had to climb up to 30,000 feet. How's it going to do that? It's impossible, I would agree. But the more likely scenario is that the mountains of the Himalayas were upthrust collision of the India with the Asian continent. And as it collided, it pushed up the entire Himalayas range all the way up to 29,000 feet, carrying along with it the strata of the remains of the marine fossils. Because we can be absolutely sure that this top of Mount Everest was only 200 feet above sea level. Didn't know that, did you? Did not? No, that's why you're here today. Okay. So, there are other Christian apologists. Some of them are very well received in the Christian evangelical community, including a Dr. Hugh Ross. So in the Christian Post in 2019, Dr. Ross had an article there, or an article about him. It says, "Did the flood of Noah cover the entire earth? Hugh Ross on what the Bible teaches." Now he's a Canadian astrophysicist. And because he's an astrophysicist and he's Canadian, a lot of Canadians think that he's amazing. Okay? So Ross, a proponent of old earth creationism, he believes that the days of Genesis are long periods of time. Okay, not like 6 days. Argued against the claim of young earth creationism that the flood covered the earth. The most explicit text, he says, about the flood come from Job, Psalm, and Proverbs. Really? I mean, Genesis was actually in detail about flood? That's not as explicit as Psalm and Proverbs? Okay, anyway. The phrase of the entire face of the earth needs to be understood in the context of the observer, he emphasized. When non-Christians discover that the Bible does not teach that the floodwaters covered the whole earth, they are more open to considering its claims as a serious inerrant document, Ross explains. What? Okay. Reason to believe, take the view that the first 11 chapters of Genesis are indeed history, that what occurred were in fact actual events, except not as recorded in Genesis. So this guy is playing with words and trying to say, oh yeah, we take it as it's written, except that it's explained differently. The days are not 24 hours, but they are millions and billions of years as long as necessary. There was no Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were 40,000 years ago from a tribe of 10,000 other hominids, etc. So he's replayed all of this. But coming back to the flood event, okay, he says that the phrase the entire face, in other words, that the flood covered the entire face of the earth, need to be understood in the context of the observer. So he's saying that the person who observed the flood is looking at it from their point of view. And it's kind of like going to Lake Ontario and looking at the lake and saying, hey, the waters covered the entire earth. But in fact, it only covered the area of Lake Ontario. But does he have this right? Is the Bible simply written from the observer's point of view? And who was the observer? Again, is it man's book about what man understood, or was it the book about what God's observation? That's the question. So people try to reinterpret it saying, well, in those days they didn't really understand all that stuff and it had to be based on the observer. No, because it's what God said happened, not what people observe happening. And so this reasons to believe, I think they've got it wrong. Okay. I think you might come to the same conclusion. So, the reason I mention it is because he's quite popular in the United States and university campuses representing Christianity. Don't have to believe the Genesis account as it's written. Believe the way we interpret it. You'll be much happier with that. Therefore, you won't have to be embarrassed about taking a young earth view. You know, a lot of this has nothing really to do with science. It has to do with pride. Because if you go around saying, I believe the earth is young and 6,000 years ago will flood, many people will mock and scoff and laugh at you thinking you're intellectually deficient. But if you want to be accepted, you say, oh no, yeah, but it's allegorical. We can accommodate millions of years, so I won't look so foolish. The question is, what did Jesus? Jesus wasn't worried about that. He was just telling the truth. And I think we should too. How about the duration of the flood? Well, the flood lasted from the 600th year, 7 month, 17th day of Noah's life until 601st year, 2nd month, 27th day of Noah's life, and a duration of 1 year and 10 days. That's how it was. And so, has God's promise been broken? The rainbow. We've seen that during the pandemic, that somehow this is a promise. People forget that the promise was only after this massive disaster, this catastrophe that hit the earth. And what was God's promise anyway? God's promise was that never again will the floodwaters destroy the earth. That's what his promise. And he said, I'm giving you as a sign of this the rainbow. Okay, this is where we get this from. But people say, like you, Ron, it's not a global flood. It was only a local flood. God said there would never be a flood of the magnitude that was recorded in Genesis. You, Ross, says, no, it's a global flood indeed. Have there been other global floods since that day? Since, obviously, even Pakistan recently went through massive flooding. So if indeed the flood of Noah's day was local, then God's promise never to bring a local flood again would have been a blatant lie and deception, because we've had local floods on and on. In fact, didn't you guys around here a few years ago have a flooding? Yeah, even in Montreal where I lived, we had flooding. It just almost hit my house, hit a neighbor's house. It was based on a little bit of slope. I had to help him shovel out his drywall, right, with the shovel because all mush. Okay, so flooding happens all over the place. So if it was local, then God would have been lying. And the rainbow isn't a promise, it's a curse. Okay? So, all people descended from Noah's family. So for example, Mizra, the actual Arabic word for Egypt is Mizra. Ana Misra, I'm Egyptian. Okay? Misra comes from Mizraim, which was Noah's grandson, who was the founder of Egypt. And Ashkenaz, Noah's great-grandson. Maybe you've heard of Ashkenazi Jews. Those are the Jews that come from Europe, specifically Germany. Okay? You also have Canaan, Hebrew name for the general region later called Palestine. We heard of the Canaanites. They're all descended from Canaan or Canaan. And Javan is a Hebrew word for Greece. These are all descendants out of Noah, coming right out of the book of Genesis. And Cush is the Hebrew word for old Ethiopia. And Meshech is the ancient name for Moscow. So all of these names were coming out of the scriptures, and we find them that the nations did come out from post-flood era. I have a little bit more later on. The New Testament speaks of the flood of global. We already covered that. We'll just skip over that. What would a global flood actually do? Well, one of the things it would do is rewrite ancient history. One of the reasons why Creation Ministries was in Egypt to try to reconcile secular Egyptian chronology, such as the timing of the pharaohs and the Sphinx and the pyramids, with biblical chronology. And it's very hard to do, and even the Egyptologist who was on the tour with us, guy's a master's in Egyptology, says it's very hard to do simply because the Egyptian chronology largely comes by a single guy by the name of Manetho. And Manetho wrote this out, but we now know, even secularists would say, he was wrong in many places, because Egypt, you may know, had two kings, an upper and lower kingdom. Sometimes the kingdoms were united, sometimes they were divided. So it all depends. Sometimes these pharaohs were contemporaneous, sometimes they were sequential. Very hard to sort out simply because the hieroglyphics, which record a lot of this stuff, don't have dates on them. So sometimes it's just in reference to another event in history when the Egyptians met the Babylonians in the Battle of Carchemish. Okay, that's a kind of a reference, but that's a little later than the pyramid. So it's very, very hard to reconcile all those two. All we know is that the Israelites did not build the pyramids, and probably the pharaoh was Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, there's more on that. We don't have time for that at the moment. Okay, erosion and deposition. We already looked at some of the covered geology, and plants would be buried on a global scale, and they're tying onto paleontology. And denying a global flood will lead to a misrepresentation of data in ancient history, geology, and paleontology. And one of the big problems is secular chronology is that there's no place in their chronology for a flood. And so then it has to be simply by, uniformitarian, and some of the oldest civilizations are the Sumerians, and so they have to spread it out over that period of time simply because the flood doesn't factor in it, and they don't take the Bible as a factor into it. So that's why there's a disconnect between secular chronology and biblical chronology. And I don't know if they're ever going to be reconciled, because the flood is a major factor both in the sciences and in the history. Do that. So what would we expect to find? Well, ancient evidence that human population in ancient nations began around 4,400 years ago. I'll skip through this quickly. So one of the things we find, the Institute of Creation Research did some analysis on flood legends. And they looked at about 200 traditions and cultures which actually have flood legends. So more or less, including the Epic of Gilgamesh had that as well. So more or less, you can see if you go to Institute of Creation Research, okay, you'll see that more or less they have similar stories. So for example, many of them have destruction by water. Most of them have humans were saved. A few of them animals, universal destruction, many of them, but various aspects of it. So even in indigenous peoples have these legends. And how could you tie all these 200 cultures together having similar stories? Now, of course, the farther you get away, if you don't have written records, of course, it's going to degrade over time, the accuracy of your stories. So the only thing you could tie them together, that this is an actual event that was recorded. And fortunately, the Bible has it recorded in writing, so it's permanent, whereas other cultures would have it less so, maybe in cuneiform or other kind of writing, but if it was simply oral, it would have been lost over time. That's why it's somewhat hazy. Okay. Also, we know that the civilization, some of the oldest civilization, we talk about the Sumerians, the Akkadians, and then the Babylonians, the Assyrians, that all happened in the region of where the ark happened. All right, so that makes sense. In the Europe and Africa and Asia, these are the three areas in which humans populated post-flood, which would have gone out. And then after that, they would have gone out to the other parts of the world at that time. All right. What about languages? This is one of the questions. Are all languages, according to evolutionary view, must have started out with some kind of proto-language, an original language, which over time simply changed into different forms of languages? But it doesn't actually line up, because we have many different ancient languages, like the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the Akkadian cuneiform writing. They don't match each other. They're actually different types. Hieroglyphics is more sounds. You get the names more to sound out the characters. Okay, and cuneiform is with wedge shaped, a whole bunch of wedge shapes. So they can't communicate with each other in those different languages. It was only, for example, the Rosetta Stone that was found in Egypt was able to put them together, because they had three parallel accounts on the same stele, and I think it's in the British Museum. You can go and see it now, the Rosetta Stone, and by that they could say, okay, they could translate hieroglyphics and cuneiform, etc. But the languages don't seem to share a common root, which they would have if it was coming from an evolutionary point of view. In fact, the biblical view would make sense that Adam and Eve would have originally had at creation the same language, and there might have been some diversity in languages as the descendants of Adam and Eve spread out through the earth at that time. We don't know much about that. But then post-flood, of course, there's only Noah and his family. They, of course, share the same language. But at the Tower of Babel, we know at the Tower of Babel, mankind didn't want to leave. They loved the place they were living. But God said, no. I give you a commandment. What was that commandment to Adam and Eve? We're supposed to follow that. They were supposed to spread out throughout the earth. Right? They were supposed to spread out through all the earth, subdue the earth. But they thought, we like it here. We ain't going. God says, yes, you are. Okay, tell you what I'm going to do. He's going to confuse the languages. So now you have a whole bunch of people who couldn't communicate with each other. So obviously they couldn't. It's very difficult to work with people when you don't understand their language at all. And so people then started migrating to different regions, and that would explain, from the biblical view, the origin of different language groups, such as from the Arabic words and all those different types of language groups. Okay? So that would explain it better than this. And sedimentary rocks. I'll just touch a bit on that because we already covered a bit of that. So in Monument Valley in Utah, my wife and I went through there in 2019, and it's on Navajo land. And so you see these monuments, they call them. They're kind of like plateaus, and very interesting layering, because you have thin layers and then you have a thick layer. The thick layer is about 100 feet thick. And then you have more thin layers on top. But it's interesting because the same pattern appears in all the monuments. So wherever you look, you see the same patterns happening, as I sort of traced it all across here. Thin layer, thick layer. Which means at one time, they were all interconnected, part of one broad sedimentary layers. But obviously, the material between the sediments ain't there no more. Where did it go? This is, by the way, a desert. There's no rivers. So how do you remove a lot of material from between the monuments? How do you explain it? Didn't dry up and evaporate, didn't get blown away by the wind. It probably was carried out by lots of water. And it would have been lots and lots of water. So during the flood, when the waters are covering the earth, they would also on the continents, and the continents would create kind of a bowl for water to be entrapped on the continent itself, like the United States and Canada. And then there would be a fracture in this and allow the water to come out and drain the water off the Gulf of Mexico or in the Pacific Ocean, and carving around the monuments. Once the water had come off the continent, dried up, and you have desert, and that's what you see today. Follow? All right. Okay. You say the same type of thing. This is in Namibia, Africa. The same type of event. Monument desert in Namibia. Kind of cool. Isn't kind of evocative of some... Anyway, you also see this in Mount Moarama in South America. Just this monument sitting high. How does it... And it's all sedimentary rocks. This, I think, was on the land that time forgot. One of those movies that prehistoric creatures lived on top. Anyway, that's just a movie. Okay, so what about this? Did I show you this before? Okay. All right. So, how do you explain? I'm just going to skip this slide. No, I won't. Okay. So, how do you explain the flood mechanism? What actually happened in the flood? Well, one of the scenarios is that we do not know exactly what triggered the flood. Obviously, it was a supernaturally initiated event. God started this. And of course, there was a lot of rain. But the Bible tells us also that the fountains of the great deep broke forth. So something underground, burst through the crust. Now, if you look at a map of the globe, and you look if you remove the ocean water, you will see these ridges. Oceanic spreading ridge. In the Atlantic, it's called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge because it's in the middle Atlantic. This type of ridge line goes around the earth 25,000 miles. And so, for some reason, the pressure underneath was so intense that it actually burst through this fracture, these ridges, and caused the material to spread left and right, and then slowly to be subducted, and I'll show a video on that later on, and then the mountain, as it goes down, this would sink down, putting pressure to lift up the continents. And here you can see, for example, mountain ridges here as they're pushed up, and various other things happening. So Dr. John Baumgartner sort of pioneered this idea, which is actually being more and more accepted by secular geologists, explaining of course, the timing will be different. In fact, here is even in the Science magazine, talks about that there might be water as much as 600 kilometers deep under the earth. Water bursts forth actually from underground. Okay, but as you can see here, so here's a crack, one of those ridges, and the water's coming through. And so here's the Bible tells us that during the flood, that the foundations of the great deep burst forth. Okay, restarting that. You can add your own sound effects because I don't have any here. Right. So here is a coming from BBC. Massive convection currents of magma occurring, going up through the, and you notice the spreading of the seafloor. That spreading of the seafloor is then subducted, going underneath down to the mantle. You can see these globs of that cooler material. Actually discussed that in their seismic tomography. Okay, here we see again the subduction. See it happening here. Watch what's happening to the material on top of it. This rocky area here. It's going to then go bing, spring back, which would create tsunamis onto the land, as you can see here. Okay, now some of them would be much bigger. Here's a tsunami moving in, and here's actually Fukushima tsunami. Actually caught that on. You can watch that on the television that when this was happening. Awesome event. And here's a model of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and you can see that the tsunamis are moving inland towards the continent. Now, we're presuming that the continents were the shape they're in now, but actually it was probably a singular continent. So this is what would have happened as a spreading. Let me show you this one again because I'm sure there's a lot of stuff in that. But even creationists are believing that one time the earth had been gathered into one place, the Bible tells us. So you had one supercontinent, Pangaea, Rohingya, depending on where it's located. And that then was fractured during the flood event. Okay, let me do this again. And so the fountains of the great deep cause, and what it would cause is those plates to spread away from each other. To split up that singular continent into a whole bunch of different pieces. They would then start moving around the earth. And here's C4 spreading, and so the hot magma here, but this would be a lot cooler. And so that's where you see the globules underneath. Again, this is BBC. It's not any creationist. Subduction occurs. And they've actually detected gold globules. It means it's not as old as it would, because if it was old, it would be the same temperature of the magma underneath. And here we have the subduction causing crustal movements and shocks, which would have created tsunamis. As we know, even the Southeast Asia tsunami and the Fukushima tsunami, it doesn't take a lot of displacement of the crust in order to create a massive tsunami, which literally killed thousands of people. Okay? This was just a small tsunami. Although it had massive, because you got to understand, this is a lot of water being displaced, and as it gets closer to the shore, the pressure increases and the height increases. Not much you can do about it. And here you see this breaking up. Now, they show the continents as they were, but here's sort of if the continents all separate, and the Mid-Atlantic Ridge would be somewhere around here, showing it how it all split from that original continent. Okay, that was pretty fast. Here we have another model, a 3D model from Dr. Baumgartner, showing how he had that single continent all splitting across and moving. And you see the elbow of South America into the armpit of Africa, and we're spreading. Okay, happened very, very quickly rather than through slow processes you would have had in under continental drift condition. Okay, recent burial. Of course, we talked about that already. Under the flood condition, it wouldn't take 10,000 years. You'd have lots of, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera. Okay, and we're skipping through stuff we covered already. So here's one other thing. Dr. Carl Werner, he did a great book, Evolution, the Grand Experiment. You get it, not Creation Ministries, I don't think we have it. But he went to 60 natural history museums around the world. He didn't tell them he was a creationist. He said, I was interviewing some, scientists in the natural history museums, talking to them, asking them questions. So he went through 65 of them, and he wrote in his book here a lot of very telling stories. We don't have time for that. But he says, paleontologists have found 432 mammal species in the dinosaur layers. Now, this is very telling. Why? Because the dinosaur layer is supposed to have dinosaurs. It was only after the dying off of the dinosaurs that mammals were allowed to populate the earth. But what he's saying says that paleontologists have actually found 432 species which lived at the same time as the dinosaurs. Okay, so that means that evolutionary sequence is a little off, quite a bit. Almost as many species as the number of dinosaur species. But where are these fossils? We visited 60 museums, but not see a single complete mammal skeleton from the dinosaur layers displayed at any of these museums. This is amazing. Well, of course, it's understandable because the museums want to give such as the Royal Tyrrell Museum, wants you to understand that the dinosaurs lived in a certain time. They were alone. And then after they died out, then the mammals rose up and started taking over the earth millions of years afterwards. Well, of course, if you have mammals and dinosaurs living at the same time, that means that evolutionary story is no longer valid. And so this geological column is. Okay, we're going to I'm almost at the end, actually. Surprising. Other consequences of the flood. And this is so what would have happened after the flood? So what would happen is the fountains of the great deep, all this hot gases and lava coming into the oceans, 25,000 miles of breakage in the earth, a lot of heat, a lot of steam. What would it do to the ocean temperature? It would rise it up. What about all the ash that came out of the volcanoes, etc.? Well, they would, so not only heat the oceans, but you would put a layer, right, of ash around the earth, which would moderate the temperature, reduce the sun's heating effect. So what would happen with all this moisture that's in the air when it gets to the North and South poles? Well, they would always precipitate in snow, etc. Lots of it. And so what's happening in the North and South Pole is that the amount of ice, snow, wouldn't melt every season. So it would accumulate slowly, vast amount of ice and snow in the northern and southern poles, increasing, so much so over hundreds of years that it would actually creep down to past where we are now, in kilometer-thick glaciers. Now, after this thing all settled down, then the temperature would start to go back to normal. Oceans would cool off, and so the winters would be moderate. And guess what's happening to the ice caps? Shrinking. Guess what's happening these days? The ice cap is shrinking. So they say it is global warming, but actually it's probably just a consequence of the Earth, the ice cap just melting away. It's natural. And so no amount of human interference is going to actually caused it, and no amount of human effort is going to fix it. But please send in your money to the government. Also, one of the things that would happen if you put all this snow and ice on the North and South Pole, kilometers thick of glaciers, that means that water is coming from the oceans, which means that the ocean level would have been a lot lower, which means that there would have been land bridges between North America and Russia through the Bering Strait, and also through the islands from Asia all the way down to Australia. You would have had all these land bridges to allow animals to migrate to those various areas. And then when the melting started again, the water levels are rising, and guess what we're worried about today? Water levels rising. That would have cut off those various areas of various continents and leave those animals isolated, such as the kangaroos in Australia. Okay, well, anybody need more information? Or you pretty much, that's it. Okay. All right, we're just going to, I'm done. All right, so you can buy Creation Magazine, and some of you, there was a bookstore downstairs. For some people who weren't aware that we actually have books and resources downstairs. Not as much as we had before, but that's a good thing. Okay.